I am asking Your Honor for the maximum sentence allowed. Thank you.
I look at you sitting there right now, looking the way you should have looked through the entire trial, like a convicted murderer.
February 2017, Nicholas Cruz buys a lot of guns, including an AR-15 style rifle, despite being diagnosed with mental health conditions. Now, who could have possibly known this would result in one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history, and a series of lawsuits as parents sought their revenge? These are parents who took revenge on school shooters.
A 14-year-old boy has shot dead 8 children at a school in Serbia. The teenager used his father's gun.
December 30th, 2024, Vladimir and Milanja Kecmanovic were sentenced to jail for a school shooting crime committed by their son. But then again, the entire story of how this all happened is as shocking as it is concerning. Let's go back to May 3rd, 2023. A tragic mass shooting takes place at Vladislav Ribnikar Elementary School in Belgrade, Serbia, when a 14-year-old boy shoots and kills 9 children and a security guard. Now, the boy, identified only as KK due to his age, has reportedly planned the attack in detail, bringing 2 guns legally owned by his father into the school. Now, his victim included 8 girls and 1 boy, along with a security guard who attempted to intervene. The shooting deeply shocked Serbia, a country where mass shootings are rare despite widespread gun ownership. The shooter was apprehended on the scene, but couldn't be criminally prosecuted because Serbian law doesn't allow the prosecution of individuals under the age of 14. Instead, he was placed in a psychiatric institution, where he remains to this day. This would leave the legal system and the victim's parents to focus on the actions of his parents, Vladimir and Milanja Kecmanovic, and any others who were implicated in the circumstances that would allow this attack to occur. December 30th, 2024, a Belgrade court sentenced Vladimir and Milanja after finding them guilty of crimes related to their son's actions. Vladimir, the boy's father, received a 14.5-year prison sentence for committing a grave offense against public safety and neglecting and abusing a minor. By not securing the firearms properly, he facilitated in his son's access to them. It's also known that Vladimir had taken the boy to a shooting range for target practice, a decision that was heavily scrutinized during the trial. Now, Milanja, the boy's mother, was sentenced to 3 years in prison for neglecting and abusing a minor. However, she was acquitted of charges related to the illegal possession of weapons and ammunition. The court also sentenced Nemanja Marinkovic, the instructor at the shooting range where the boy had been trained, to a year and 3 months in prison. The trial drew significant public and legal attention, more specifically from families of the victims, who actively sought accountability and revenge for that tragedy. Although the boy himself couldn't be prosecuted, his parents were held responsible for their role in the events leading up to that massacre.
Ja mislim da je jako važno za cijelo društvo da ovaj slučaj dobije epilog u smislu krivične odgovornosti za počinjeno masovno ubistvo i to je apsolutno.
Now, the families of the victims are still pursuing legal actions against the Kecmanovic family, with many civil lawsuits still ongoing. The courtroom proceedings were closely followed, with members of the victims' families attending and expressing their grief and desire for justice. During the trial, KK was brought out of the psychiatric institution for the first time since the attack to testify against his parents. His testimony was delivered in a high-security courtroom, typically reserved for cases involving organized crime or war crimes. KK would express regret for his actions but didn't provide an explanation for his motives. His testimony was part of a trial that aimed to determine the extent of his parents' responsibility for the events. Following his testimony, the family's lawyer told reporters that the boy had lived a normal life before the shooting, and no court process would be able to establish what had led to this attack. The sentencing of Vladimir and Milanja was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as a step toward justice. Others, particularly the families of the victims, felt that the penalties were insufficient given the scale of the tragedy. The prosecution had announced plans for harsher sentences for Vladimir and the shooting instructor, while the defense also planned to appeal those convictions. This tragedy led to widespread calls for reform in Serbia, including stricter gun control measures and greater accountability for parental negligence. In response to the massacre, the Serbian government designated May 3rd and 4th as days of remembrance for victims of mass shootings.
Police say that a student at a private school killed a classmate and a teacher and hurt 6 others on campus before taking her own life.
August 2024, Jeff Rupno takes his daughter Natalie to a gun shooting range. How could he have known that this little father-daughter outing would come back to haunt him in the worst way possible? December 16th, 2024, a tragic school shooting happens at Abundant Life Christian School in Madison, Wisconsin. The attacker, 15-year-old Natalie Rupno, also known as Samantha, opened fire during a study hall, killing 2 people and injuring 6 others. Natalie then ended the attack by turning the gun on herself. During the incident, which took place shortly before 11 a.m., witnesses reported hearing gunshots and screams. As chaos erupted in the classroom, students and teachers scrambled to find safety while Natalie fired indiscriminately. Unfortunately, Erin West, a teacher employed part-time by the school and known for her dedication to her students, was struck and died at the scene, as did Ruby Vergara, who was a freshman at that school and a very talented young artist. 6 others would be injured, with 2 hospitalized in critical condition. Authorities would arrive minutes after a second-grade teacher at the school made the 911 call to report the shooting, securing the school and recovering the firearms. The guns used in the shooting became a focal point of the investigation. Authorities showed that Natalie used a handgun during the attack, which she had reportedly brought from home. A second firearm was found at the scene as well, but wasn't used. Investigations would suggest Natalie had been planning this attack, possibly influenced by an online acquaintance in California named Alexander Pfaffendorf, who was also allegedly plotting a mass shooting and an attack on a government building. Pfaffendorf has since been detained by the FBI and ordered to temporarily surrender his firearms. Additionally, the police are tracing the guns used by Natalie and examining whether the parents had been negligent in their storage. Court documents would reveal their tumultuous family setting with 2 divorces, shared custody agreements, and a history of therapy sessions for Natalie. In addition to that, evidence also showed Natalie's father, Jeff Rupno, frequently would take her to shooting ranges. A Facebook photo from August 2024 shows Natalie at a range, wearing a black shirt bearing the name of the band, KMFDM. Now, interestingly, some of the band's lyrics had been cited by the students who carried out the 1999 massacre at Columbine High School in Colorado, where 13 people were killed. Now, going to shooting ranges is legal and can be seen as a family bonding activity for some families, but critics argue it may have desensitized Natalie to firearms. The question remains whether her parents recognized or ignored warning signs that could have prevented the tragedy. However, the grieving families of Erin West and Ruby Vergara refused to let the case end with Natalie's death. The case open and investigations ongoing. They're demanding justice not only for their children, but also for the country's systemic failures. They're ensuring that Natalie's parents are held responsible. Currently, Melissa and Jeff Rupno haven't been charged with any crime, but authorities are exploring the possibility of negligence. Under Wisconsin law, it's illegal to recklessly store firearms within easy access of minors. Madison Police Chief Sean Barnes has also confirmed the parents are cooperating with the investigation and emphasized that determining their role is a priority.
The parents of school shooter Ethan Crumbley were back in court where they were sentenced for manslaughter in connection with their son's murder of 4 students at his Michigan school.
It's November 2021, and James and Jennifer Crumbley are called to their son's school over a disturbing suicidal drawing found in his desk. Now, they would dismiss that drawing and leave him in school, but what happened shortly after got him rethinking that decision. November 30th, 2021, a mass shooting takes place at Oxford High School in Oxford Township, Michigan, when 15-year-old Ethan Robert Crumbley opens fire on students and staff with a 9mm semi-automatic handgun. The attack left 4 students dead: Madison Baldwin, Tate Meyer, Hannah St. Juliana, and Justin Schilling, and 7 others injured, including a teacher. Ethan's movements were captured on surveillance cam as he exited a bathroom armed with the gun and began shooting indiscriminately in the hallways and toward the classrooms. The shooting lasted only about 5 minutes, during which Ethan fired 32 rounds. Thankfully, students and teachers responded quickly by locking the doors and barricading classrooms, which minimized further casualties. Police would arrive within minutes of receiving the 911 calls and apprehended Ethan without resistance. Now, he would have ammunition still in his possession ammunition, along with two 15-round magazines. In the aftermath, Ethan was charged as an adult with 24 counts, including 4 counts of first-degree murder and terrorism causing death. October 2022, Ethan pled guilty to all charges. 1 year later, he's sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, plus an additional 24 years, holding him fully accountable for the violence. This made him the first minor to receive a life sentence without parole under a 2012 U.S. Supreme Court ruling that deemed such sentences necessary in rare cases like Ethan's. However, the legal repercussions didn't stop with the shooter himself. The unprecedented nature of the case drew attention to the role of Ethan's parents, James and Jennifer Crumbly, whose actions, or lack thereof, became a focal point for the victims' families seeking justice. The Crumblys have faced intense scrutiny for their parental decisions leading up to the tragedy. James Crumbly had bought the handgun used in the shooting as a gift for his son just days before the attack. But that's not all, because Jennifer had also taken Ethan to a gun range to practice shooting that same weekend. Moreover, hours before the incident, the parents were called to the school after a teacher found a disturbing note on Ethan's desk. It would show a gun, a bleeding person, and the words, "The thoughts won't stop, help me." I don't know what else you need there, but they still left Ethan at school, unaware or willfully negligent that he had brought the gun to campus. And to make matters worse, they didn't inform school officials that they had purchased a gun for him 4 days earlier. Now, for the victims' families, the Crumblys' actions symbolized a level of negligence that demanded accountability. Determined to see justice served, they pushed for the parents to also face criminal charges. And shortly after, prosecutors charged James and Jennifer with 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 1 for each student killed. But after failing to appear at their arraignment, the Crumblys became the subjects of a nationwide manhunt. They were eventually apprehended in Detroit, hiding in an art studio. Their trials were held separately, but both were convicted in 2024 of involuntary manslaughter. And on April 9th, 2024, they were given 10 to 15 years in prison, making them the first parents in U.S. history to be held criminally responsible for their child's school shooting. Now, during the sentencing, the victims' families gave emotional statements. Nicole Beausoleil, whose daughter Madison Baldwin was killed, expressed her anguish and frustration.
Accountability can only be given if you actually tried in the first place. Those decisions that you made ultimately took my daughter's life because you decided that you didn't want to parent and listen to your son.
Other parents gave their sentiments, pointing out the Crumblys' failures to intervene despite clear warning signs. The judge had stressed the convictions weren't just about poor parenting, but repeated negligence that led to the shooting. But the court also would note that the basic steps like securing a gun or even addressing their son's behavioral problems could have prevented the tragedy. Throughout the trial, Jennifer Crumbly expressed remorse, but also attempted to deflect blame onto the school, arguing that officials failed to act decisively. Now, James Crumbly maintained that he didn't know about his son's intentions and wished he had acted differently. However, the prosecution argues that their gross negligence changed the lives of an entire community forever. Now, the families are currently advocating for systemic changes as they call for reform in parental responsibility, gun safety laws, and the accountability of schools in preventing this violence. Now, that's not all. Lawsuits were also filed against the school district, alleging negligence in failing to act on warning signs exhibited by Ethan Crumbly. In fact, according to students and parents, rumors about threats of a mass shooting at that school were circulating way before it occurred, prompting some students to stay home the day of the incident.
He entered that classroom and proceeded to fire the rifle into that classroom.
It's Christmas, December 2023, and Colt Gray gets an AR-style weapon from his father. And again, who would have known that this could have resulted in one of the craziest school shootings in the history of Georgia? September 4th, 2024, a mass shooting occurs at the Appalachia High School near Winder, Georgia. The shooter, identified as 14-year-old Colt Gray, allegedly shot at 11 people, resulting in the deaths of 2 students and 2 teachers, and leaving another 8 students and 1 teacher injured. Prior to the shooting, investigations showed that Colt had meticulously planned out everything.
We also found another notebook in that same room. It was a drawing of a rifle with what appears to be ammunition coming out of it, and then the word kids.
Aside from that, the school also received a threatening call from an unknown source, claiming that 5 schools would be targeted, with Appalachia High School being the first. Carry on, a second call would come from Gray's mom, warning of an extreme emergency and urging school administrators to locate her son. Despite the warning, school authorities were unable to find him. That morning, during his first period class, Gray asked how the school would respond to an active shooter. His teacher did report the question to some staff via email, but wasn't able to inform the teacher of Gray's algebra class, where the shooting would begin. Then, at 9:42 a.m., Gray sent a cryptic text to his father, apologizing and telling him that he wasn't to blame. 20 minutes later, he sends a similar message to his mom, and by 9:45 a.m., Gray had left his algebra classroom, the door locking automatically behind him, and he enters a student restroom, where he puts on yellow plastic gloves and retrieves a concealed gun from his backpack. Wrapped up in white poster board, the weapon had been placed around his lower torso. Now, around this time, another student with a similar name to Gray was mistakenly apprehended by school resource officers following the reports of something suspicious. This mistake, unfortunately, delayed their ability to locate the actual shooter, and minutes later, Gray tried to return to his algebra classroom. However, as a student approached the door, he noticed the gun through the glass panel and refused to let him in, and quickly told his teacher that Gray was armed. Seeing that he couldn't get into the classroom, Gray moved to a nearby classroom instead and fired 10 to 15 rounds, tragically killing a student named Christian Angulo. From there, he continued shooting while running down the hallway toward the bathrooms. As the shots rang out, multiple staff members triggered the panic buttons on their ID badges, initiating a lockdown and notifying law enforcement. Some students initially mistook the shooting for a drill, even as gunfire would echo through the halls. One of the teachers who died that day was shot in the chest after stepping out of his classroom to see what was happening. His students quickly pulled him back inside and tried to stop the bleeding with their shirts. They just couldn't save him. In another classroom, a student who was shot managed to shut the door, keeping Gray from getting inside, and then only afterward realized he was injured. The school went into lockdown at around 10:20 a.m., and law enforcement arrived by 10:23. The lockdown system caused all smart boards in the school to display hard lockdown in large red letters, a message that some students mistook for a drill. Luckily, within minutes of the first shots, school resource officers engaged Gray, and he surrendered without further resistance. Not long after, students were evacuated to the school's football field once the building was declared safe. In the chaos, some students recalled seeing police officers attempting to shield a body from view, along with a gun and blood at the scene. The situation was so dire that the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, directed all available state resources to assist in the aftermath. In the end, Gray was arrested and charged with 55 counts, including 4 for murder, 4 for felony murder, 4 for aggravated battery, 25 for aggravated assault, and 18 for first-degree cruelty to children. Also, despite his young age, prosecutors announced plans to try him as an adult. So during the investigation, authorities would show that Gray had used a semi-auto AR-15 style rifle to carry out the shooting. Further inquiry would uncover some more troubling details, because Colin O'Gray had purchased that firearm for his son as a Christmas gift. The decision was made despite prior warnings from the FBI, which had flagged Gray's threatening messages on Discord, where he had spoken of a desire to commit a school shooting. And as a result of this, the families of the victims who were still grieving their loss didn't stop at seeking justice against Gray. Recognizing the role the father played in enabling that tragedy, they shifted focus toward Colin Gray. His actions, particularly the decision to arm his son despite clear warnings, were seen as critical factors that contributed to the devastating attack. October 2024, Colt's father faced multiple charges, such as involuntary manslaughter, second-degree murder, and cruelty to children. These are some of the most serious charges ever filed against a parent in a U.S. school shooting case, as they would point to a significant failure in allowing Colt to access a weapon despite his history of violent threats. Also, since Gray's parents are divorced, the father bore the entire responsibility for his role in providing the firearm. November 21st, 2024, Colin Gray waived his arraignment and pled not guilty to the 29 charges he faced. As the case continues, the victim's parents remain hopeful for justice. The shooting is currently regarded as the deadliest school shooting in Georgia's history, with the school remaining closed for nearly 3 weeks before reopening on September 24th, 2024.
I look at you sitting there right now, looking the way you should have looked through the entire trial, like a convicted murderer. In your prison outfit, shackled.
Tonight, he's now been formally sentenced to 34 consecutive sentences of life in prison.
February 14th, 2018, Nicholas Cruz commits one of the deadliest high school shootings in U.S. history that left 17 dead and 17 injured. The gravity of this incident had the parents of the victims calling for his head, as they would stop at nothing to get their revenge. Born September 24th, 1998, Nicholas Cruz was expelled from Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School due to disciplinary issues in 2017. As he exhibited a history of troubling behavior, he would be diagnosed with mental health conditions and was eligible for special education. As a result, Cruz was well known to school authorities and mental health professionals. In addition to that, his social media profiles would further show his alarming tendencies. He posted pictures of himself with weapons and would make violent threats. In fact, many calls were made to law enforcement about his behavior, including warnings that he might become a school shooter. In one case, this anonymous tip in 2016 would warn about Cruz's plans to buy a gun and hurt others, but this wasn't properly addressed then. February 2017, Cruz somehow legally purchases an AR-15 style rifle after passing a background check despite all his warning signs. In fact, before that, he had bought several other firearms, including at least one shotgun and many other rifles, which he was seen firing for practice months before the shooting. Now, his ability to get those guns would expose some extreme flaws within the system, actually meant to stop troubled people from getting firearms. This was what the parents of the victims would later capitalize on to get their revenge, as you will come to see. February 14th, 2018, Cruz, 19 years old at the time, arrived at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in an Uber. He carried a rifle case and a backpack filled with ammo. At around 2:19 p.m., just 20 minutes before school ended, he entered Building 12, which held about 900 students and staff across 3 floors. A campus monitor noticed Cruz and radioed a colleague about his suspicious movements toward the building. However, no lockdown was called because the protocols were unclear. This gave Cruz enough time to assemble his rifle in a stairwell, and as he's doing that, Cruz meets a student, Christopher McKenna, who told him to leave immediately, with a warning that something bad was about to happen. Although later McKenna did run to inform staff, by then Cruz had already started his attack. Cruz gets to the first floor hallway and opens fire, killing Martin Anguiano, Gina Montalto, and Luke Hoyer. He then targeted other classrooms, shooting through their doors and windows, killing 6 more students and wounding 13 others. Although teachers and staff attempted to shield students, Cruz came prepared. The fire alarm, triggered by gunfire, added to the chaos, leading students and staff to evacuate into the hallways where they became more vulnerable. And aside from that, many classrooms would lack designated hard corners for shelter, which further exposed those inside to danger. Cruz killed 2 staff members on the first floor before moving upstairs. On the second floor, Cruz fired into empty classrooms, continuing his spree of violence as he ascended to the 3rd floor. There he found kids stranded in the hallway and opened fire again, killing 5 more students and 1 staff member. 3 students and a teacher were also injured on this floor. In a final effort to maximize casualties, Cruz entered a teacher's lounge and attempted to shoot through hurricane-resistant windows at students and staff fleeing below. When the windows didn't shatter, Cruz abandoned his whole plan, dropped his weapon, and tried to blend in with the fleeing students to escape. This nightmare lasted about 6 minutes, leaving 14 students and 3 staff members dead after Cruz fired 139 shots. After the shooting, he would flee on foot, stopping at a nearby fast food restaurant. However, he'd be arrested about 80 minutes later in Coral Springs. His capture and confession confirmed his guilt, with further evidence like surveillance and witness statements supporting his actions. For the families of the victims, pursuing justice became their primary focus. October 20th, 2021, Cruz pled guilty to all charges and expressed remorse for his crimes. And while the prosecution sought the death penalty, a jury was unable to reach the unanimous decision required under Florida law. November 2nd, 2022, Cruz was given 34 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, 1 for each of the total number of victims murdered. However, he would also face additional charges for attacking an officer a few months after his arrest, which would include aggravated assault on an officer, battery against an officer, and misuse of an electric or chemical weapon. For that, he was given an extra 26 years in prison.
Today, the wrong verdict was given.
We are beyond disappointed with the outcome today.
I'm stunned
I'm devastated.
Many families view this outcome as insufficient, feeling it failed to match the gravity of his crimes. And so their pursuit of accountability went beyond Cruz themselves, targeting the systemic failures that allowed the tragedy to occur. First, the parents of Jamie Gutenberg and Alex Schachter, two of the victims, filed lawsuits against Smith & Wesson, the manufacturer of the rifle used in the attack, and Sunrise Tactical Supply, the retailer that sold the weapon. They would argue that these entities bore responsibility for enabling the foreseeable misuse of assault-style weapons. Survivors would file lawsuits against Broward County, the sheriff's office, and school officials, accusing them of negligence in failing to protect students. While a judge dismissed one lawsuit, citing a lack of legal duty to protect individuals from the shooter, the families would persist in seeking accountability through other legal avenues. By 2021, a landmark $25 million settlement was reached between the Broward County School District and the families of 52 victims. This would address allegations of negligence by the district, which critics argued failed to act on numerous warning signs about Cruz. Later that year, though, families also secured a settlement of $125 to $130 million from the federal government. Now, that agreement was tied to the FBI's admitted failure to follow up on a tip received a month before the shooting, which detailed Cruz's weapons cache, threats, and erratic behavior. The failure to act on that information represented another preventable lapse in the chain of events leading to the attack. The legal battles wouldn't stop here, though, because in 2024, Anthony Borges, a survivor who was severely injured in that shooting, reached a civil settlement with Cruz. Borges was granted control over Cruz's name, preventing him from profiting through interviews, films, or even books. Borges's legal team stated the objective was to strip Cruz of any power to harm his victims further, even from behind bars. The Parkland tragedy would result in legislative changes and activism. If you want to buy a gun in Florida now, you have to be 21, and they would implement other red flag laws, allowing authorities to temporarily confiscate weapons from individuals deemed a threat. The shooting also gave rise to the March of Our Lives movement, spearheaded by Parkland survivors advocating for stricter gun control measures nationwide. The Parkland school shooting remains one of the deadliest high school shootings in U.S. history. Now, interestingly, Cruz told a psychologist that he committed the shooting on Valentine's Day because he believed that no one loved him.